Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz1st Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the economy. As election fever heats up, Deputy Minister of National Policies and Economic Affairs, Dr. Harsha De Silva, has come out strongly in defense of the United National Party-led policies to get the debt-hit economy back on track. These strong arguments come on the back of concerns that were raised by President Maithripala Sirisena regarding the management of the economy. Meanwhile, as citizens are eagerly awaiting the next steps that will be taken on the report of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry on Treasury bond issuances, the Colombo High Court has ordered to extend the freezing of bank accounts of 24 companies under the Perpetual Treasury's umbrella. Also in the news this week, Sri Lanka is doing a little better on the Global Budget Index for 2017. Also coming up on Biz1st Review 360 this week, a top South Asian strategist is saying that India should not look to limit Chinese influence in Sri Lanka, but instead maintain its own influence without losing pace. That's coming up later on in the show. First, a look at this week's top stories.
In defense of the UNP's economic policies, Deputy Minister Dr. Harsha De Silva insisted that the Good Governance government had managed to stabilize the economy since it came to power. Speaking to reporters at a media briefing in Colombo, Deputy Minister De Silva said President Maithripala Sirisena didn't intend to take over key ministries overseeing the economy. If he intended to take over the Ministry of National Policies and Economic Affairs, he would have done so by now. The President didn't intend any such move. Few minutes after his remark, I met him personally and asked him about it. He didn't mean taking over, but he had concerns over local industrialists and cost of living. We are aware of these issues. We have to work with the National Economic Council. That's what he said. That is what he meant, not taking over the reins.
ඒක තමයි තුමා අදහස් කරේ. එහෙම නැතුව මේ අමාත්‍යාංශ ටික පවර ගන්නවා කියලා එහෙම අදහසක් කරේ නැහැ. එහෙමනම් කරා නම් මෙලහට කරලා තියෙනවා.
Commenting on the management of accumulated debt, Deputy Minister Dr. Harsha De Silva charged the previous regime of violating the State Asset Registry. He also assured that the Liability Management Bill would be presented in Parliament soon.
You know, we have to have a liability management action plan. I heard that some people are laughing at that also. I mean, these people must be, taken to task. We have a strategy, right? How to deal with the bunching issue. That is the real issue that we are facing from 2019 to 2022. Yeah, so that is why the Liability Management Act needs to go through Parliament and get approval in Parliament in order to ensure that the Liability Management Act is essentially used exclusively for liability management. Exclusively for liability management. In the account of the consolidated account, the government, even though in 2003 Ranil Wickremesinghe's government under the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act mandated that the asset registry should be maintained, Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, he as a finance minister, didn't maintain an asset registry from 2005 to 2015. The asset registry started only in 2015 to create the asset registry. So that is why between 2015 and 2017 we have only about $1 trillion rupees worth of assets in the asset registry. And we asked the Treasury said it will take another 5 years. In another 5 years' time, they will be able to complete the asset registry up to that time, right? Because they have to catch up. And even if you complete the asset registry after 5 years, you will not have more than 50% of what you borrowed in the assets. Others have been spent to pay loans back, transferred as subsidies, and so on and so forth.
Think tank Variety research says Sri Lanka has done a little better than previously, but is still in the bottom of the Open Budget Index 2017 when compared with other South Asian countries. Sri Lanka scored 44 in the 2017 Open Budget Index from a score of 39 in 2015. The index assesses transparency, public participation and budget oversight of 102 countries in a 100-point scale. Countries with extensive information on its budget scored higher, while countries with limited information scored between 41 to 60 points. Variety Research says despite the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act of 2003 that governs the disclosures and actions around the formulations and reporting on budgets, Sri Lanka has fared poorly in 2017 Open Budget Index.
So we are releasing reports as the law requires, but the comprehensibility, the adequacy, the consistency of information is inadequate, making the ultimate outcome that the law is targeting actually not achieved in Sri Lanka year on year. Sri Lanka can publish a comprehensible, non-technical budget document. The kind of simple word for that is it's called a citizen's budget. That is a budget that is not overly technical, capable of being understood by people in general, and most countries publish such a document, and Sri Lanka has not in the last period. Now, really, the Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, does assume that that implementing the Act will increase public awareness of government's fiscal policy and establish standards for evaluating the government's conduct. So it does assume that the public will have a good understanding of the budget and be able to evaluate what the government is doing based on the documents published. So the Act requires in the publication of certain documents, the budget speech, the draft budget estimates that go to Parliament, and both of these are published, but unfortunately not in a way that achieves the goal.
The Ministry of Industry and Commerce said apparel exports hit a record $4.81 billion in 2017, an increase of 3.06% from 2016's $4.6 billion. According to the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, this is the highest annual export revenue to be recorded for Lankan apparels. Exports for the month of December 2017 were at $452 million, a 21% increase compared to the same period in 2016. 45% of apparel exports in 2017 at $2.163 billion went to US, while 42% at $2.025 billion headed to the EU. Year-on-year exports to US showed a 2% increase in 2017 from 2016's $2.1 billion. Still, year-on-year exports to EU surged by a larger 4.13% to $2.02 billion in 2017 from 2016's $1.944 billion. It is estimated that two-thirds of Lankan apparel workers are women, and therefore this sector is a major industry supporting the development of the country's female labour force. As predicted by the central bank, inflation eased 5.8% in the 12 months to January 2018 from 7.1% in December 2017 as measured by the Colombo Consumer Price Index.
Don't go anywhere. On the other side of this break, we have an exclusive interview with Nitin Gokhale, the author of the best-selling book Securing India, The Modi Way, Surgical Strikes and more. Welcome back to the show. The Indian Ocean is gaining more attention globally, especially as China begins to increase her engagements here with mega investments in infrastructure projects in South Asian countries. Newsfirst Sarita Fernando sat down with Nitin Gokhale, one of the region's top leading strategic analysts, to find out about Indian perspectives on China's increased engagement with Sri Lanka.
Welcome, Mr. Gokhale, to Sri Lanka, and thank you for joining Biz in Focus.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm really honored that you are interviewing me.
Thank you. Since Prime Minister Narendra Modi took over in 2014, we've seen a shift in Indian foreign policy and security aspects, how he dealt with the situation, observing the previous administration's style of governance. Can you take us through briefly on these changes?
Well, you're right. Mr. Modi, after taking over in May 2014, has made some fundamental changes to India's approach to foreign policy. and to security aspects of the Indian government. And they relate to two basic things. One is that it is a pragmatic, bold and a proactive policy which is putting India first. So it is not dictated by the desire for India to be a good boy in international circles, that India is not trying to please everyone. India is doing what is good for India. And for instance, if you look at the India-Israel relationship, he's taken it out in the open, not hesitated to go to Israel. At the same time, when it came to voting on the Jerusalem issue in the UN, India voted against the US and the Israeli resolution. So it's a horses for courses policy. It is bolder, it has looked China in the eye, has stood firm against China wherever necessary, but at the same time being reasonable in diplomacy. It has tried to reach out a hand of friendship under Mr. Modi to Pakistan initially. When Pakistan and China both did not respond positively, he has taken a tougher stand and has actually worked to isolate Pakistan in West Asia, especially in the Islamic world. So fundamentally what he has done is he has put India first and has said that whatever is good for India's national interest should be the policy for India, both in foreign affairs and defense and security. That is the fundamental change that he has brought about.
Right. Now, reaching out to ASEAN and also other regional countries, powerful countries, like he invited the South Asian leaders on his inauguration. Do you see it as sort of a mechanism to balance the Chinese influence in this part of the region?
Well, that is an ongoing process, but I think India will make a mistake if it tries to match the Chinese influence dollar by dollar or rupee by rupee. India does not have deep pockets like the Chinese have. But India must cash in on and also build on what are centuries-old relationships, traditional people-to-people relationship that India has with the neighborhood. Take Sri Lanka, for example. I mean, it is much beyond security or even trade relationship between India and Sri Lanka. I mean, I think the cultural affinities that the two countries share is perhaps the closest amongst any country in the neighborhood in South Asia. So what India has to look at is not to limit Chinese influence, but also continue to maintain its influence in the neighborhood and see to it that it does not lose space. While you cannot stop the Chinese from giving what they are giving to the countries in the neighborhood, and every country has to take its own call in their own national interest. If India is taking a call in national interest of India, then you must allow space for Sri Lanka to take decision in its own national interest. And in Sri Lanka, for instance, needs money from China, let's say. China is willing to give money. So why not? My only point is that there has to be, between the two countries, between Colombo and New Delhi, there has to be a self-drawn, mutually acceptable line where it is not crossed, where India feels hurt or Sri Lanka feels hurt. I think that is a mutual understanding they must have.
I would like to elaborate on that point a bit. Since we also had a change of government, how do you see the two governments, the bilateral relations between these two governments? How has it been the past couple of years?
I think it's on an even keel. If I have to really nitpick, then I would say I expected a little more progress in terms of deepening from both sides, from India and Sri Lanka, but maybe more so on the Indian side, more deepening of relationship, maybe have a defense pact with Sri Lanka, maybe take the trade up a little bit more, rather than quibble about for New Delhi too. New Delhi is a bigger country, and we've been neighbors, we are neighbors, and we are being had ups and downs in our relationship between India and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka must be allowed its own space, And more than the government, I think there are commentators and there are analysts who continue to badger Sri Lanka in saying that you have gone into the Chinese camp. I don't think Sri Lanka has any option but to, especially given its last 10-15 years of history, where it needed help in terms of military hardware, it needed help in terms of money and funds. It took the opportunity which was presented itself by the Chinese, whereas India was hesitant for its own domestic reasons. So I don't think Indians should quibble about it, but I would like this relationship to go higher and become a little deeper than what it is right.
Looking back at those instances where we couldn't secure Indian help, what are the consequences in terms of Indian Ocean geopolitics for both countries?
Well, I think, first of all, I must remove this misconception that Indian help wasn't there. Indian help was there, but it was a covert help. India gave a lot of intelligence. India gave a lot of
people don't know about it.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about it. I've detailed that in my book. In fact, a lot of intelligence was given about movement of shipments of arms and ammunition which was coming to LTTE illegally. So India was helpful in that. India also was supportive of Sri Lanka and the UN in the initial years, when the war was on. So it was holding back the West, which was trying to attack and trying to stop Sri Lanka's effort to demolish or completely overcome militarily the LTTE challenge. But that apart, what the consequences have been that Sri Lanka perforce was forced to look towards China, look towards Pakistan for arms and ammunition, and finally also allow the other countries to come and either attack Sri Lanka or support. So that has resulted in Sri Lanka being hemmed in by a lot of Western countries. But I think that has changed we are going to complete 10 years next year of the conflict ending in 2009. And I think Sri Lanka is now better placed thanks to change geopolitical situation and Indian Ocean becoming a new playground for contestation between various countries. I think Sri Lanka has a very pivotal role to play. I would like India, Sri Lanka, Maldives maritime cooperation to be revived. It has unfortunately not been taken forward, although it was a good concept. So that is one instance of how things have changed or should going forward should change. The other is the trade and the defence pact between India and Sri Lanka must be clinched. I don't know where the difficulties are. If you talk to the Sri Lankan side, they say that India is not initiating it. India says there are difficulties on the Sri Lankan side. So I think the diplomats will have to work on both sides and try and clinch it. But I think the missed opportunities can be overcome, and we can look for further enhancement of the relationship going forward.
Right. What about Hambantota? Do you see any security sort of strategic location of Hambantota? Because a lot of people say it's Chinese interest is purely commercial. How does India see this?
Well, India lost the opportunity, and it's India's fault completely, that when it was offered to India first in 2005, India refused to take it. It did not see the potential. So India cannot really complain now if the Chinese have come there and Sri Lanka has given it to the Chinese. Having said that, let us believe the Chinese at the moment that it's only for commercial purposes. Unless I see anything to the contrary, that there is a military base and there's going to be a turnaround. Because I think after that incident about the Chinese submarine docking in Colombo, I think India has made it clear to Sri Lanka that that was the red line that was crossed. And to my knowledge, I think Sri Lanka has acknowledged it and said that, okay, henceforth no submarines will come. So if India is satisfied with that, I don't think India should be too concerned or is concerned about Hambantota. Although I would think India is more concerned about the Colombo port project, which the Chinese are doing. And that is something India should have again, sort of participated in or had taken over when the offer was made, if the offer was made.
India can still get involved in terms of investment because it's
I'm sure the
opening
Indian
out.
private sector should, and I think the Indian government should encourage Indian private sector to come in there, because ultimately how much money can the Chinese bring in? And I think Sri Lanka will have a dearth of money in that sense, local money being invested there. So there is, I agree with you, that there is an opportunity for Indian private sector, if not the government, to come and work with the Chinese companies here.
What is the strategy behind Indian interest in Mottola Airport?
Well, I think it's like thinking that let's have some presence in the south of Sri Lanka. I think India has done tremendous work in the north, rebuilding houses and helping demining and on a lot of development projects. But Indian presence in the south has been limited. So I think perhaps one of the reasons for taking over that project or sort of participating in that project is the thinking could be that. I'm not really aware of the details of how it is taken over, but at first glance it looks to me that India wants to be present in south.
We have an ambition to become the hub for the Indian Ocean. How do you see bilateral relations between the two countries progressing? How can we take it forward, especially in terms of maritime security?
The commitment from both sides that the sea lanes of communication are inviolable. I mean, there should be no disruption to that. I think should be taken forward. And if they can cooperate on security and intelligence issues, which I'm sure they do, the Indian Navy and the Sri Lankan Navy, the Indian Coast Guard and the Sri Lankan Coast Guard, if they continue to take it up one step at a time, I think India and Sri Lanka are best placed to ensure security of the sea lanes of communication, given the geographical locations both countries enjoy, or the advantage both countries enjoy. Beyond that, I think at the moment I don't see, and Colombo port is in any case important for Indian transshipment and trade, all that is happening. I would like to see more Indian private investment in Sri Lankan industry and also the tourism industry, because I think Sri Lanka has tremendous potential. It's one of the nicest countries to be present as a tourist, to go around, warm people, beautiful scenic locations, and complete sort of ease of traveling around. I think there should be much more that Sri Lanka should be doing and looking for Indian investment perhaps in that sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gokhale, for joining us. Thank you.
My pleasure too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for this.
On the other side of this break, a top economist takes stock of Sri Lanka's economy in 2017 and highlights what the government needs to address immediately to get the economy back on track. Welcome back to the show. Recently, the review caught up with Professor Razin Sali, Associate Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and probably more importantly for us here in Sri Lanka, Chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies, the semi-government think tank. We asked Professor Sali about what his views were on the economic performance of the country in 2017 and what the government needs to do to get things right going forward.
This government has had 3 years now, and not much to show for 3 years. It's good that we have a new finance minister and a new team in the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Samaraweera's last budget was a distinct improvement on previous budgets. There were some good announcements in that mix. The important thing is to use that momentum to actually implement some key reforms this year on opening up to international trade, for example on shipping and logistics, on improving the ease of doing business where mountains need to be moved, and on stabilizing the economy overall, fiscal consolidation as it's called, and we need that to have a stable monetary policy and a stable exchange rate. The key things are first to prioritize an action list, if you like, of doable reforms on the economy, and second to really get things implemented, which is where Sri Lanka historically and even more so in recent years has fallen short. So we've had a global economic recovery of sorts over the past year and a bit, and at the heart of that is a trade recovery, and so Sri Lanka has benefited from that with its garments exports and other exports. But that's not because we've seen a structural improvement in the Sri Lankan economy. What goes up can come down globally. If we are to, what Sri Lanka needs is a huge boost to its international trade. Exports, imports, inward investment. It needs to integrate into global value chains. It needs to diversify beyond garments into other manufacturing niches and especially into services. All of these things will only happen if we have structural changes to the domestic economy, if doing business is easier in Sri Lanka, if we have more efficient factors of production, land, labor and capital. To do that we need serious reforms. If those are done, then in due course, yes, I'm confident we'll see significant improvement long term, not just as a short-term blip in our export performance. But so far that's not happened. It's part of the broader package of having more disciplined public expenditure, making sure that subsidies don't get out of control, and also that they're better targeted to those who really need them, not to all and sundry. So I hope that it can actually materialize and be implemented during the course of this year, and that things like election campaigns won't derail it. Of course, other things need to be done to these sectors. You're talking about sectors where the state-owned incumbents are responsible for huge losses, which are part of overall losses of SOEs that amount to something like 10% of GDP, and they're very inefficiently run. They have constituencies that hold the country to hostage, and that have disproportionate power and influence. So all of these things need to be reformed. Some of these things are simply politically too difficult to reform in the short term, but I suppose reform does have to begin with more rational pricing. I mean, the finance minister has a very good team in the ministry, his personal advisors, including the head of his PPP agency. The obstacles are not there, the obstacles are elsewhere. Sri Lankan Airlines to begin with, and perhaps other parts of government. Speaking personally, I'm not sure Sri Lanka needs a national airline, least of all a state-owned and state-run airline. There might well be a market for a private sector taker for an airline that specializes in short to medium haul flights based out of Colombo, but something needs to be done, and fairly soon, because it is something that's just bleeding money at the taxpayers' expense. There is, of course, the big issue of the government divesting all or part of its stake in Sri Lankan Airlines and handing over management to something more efficient. But let's not forget there are other reforms that can be done to make our airport hub more efficient. Why does Sri Lankan Airlines have a monopoly of ground handling? Why are airport charges at Katunayaka so high by regional comparison? Why is the airport practically empty at some hours of the day? Now, some of that relates to Sri Lankan Airlines as an airline, but a lot of it relates to the actual management of the airport. So we can actually introduce more markets and more competition around Sri Lankan Airlines, including ground handling. And we need to get our charges, our airport charges, down to be more competitive regionally and internationally, so that airlines can be persuaded to come in and make use of the airport, and even use it as a regional hub. Decision making in government is very messy and inefficient. It doesn't help having so many ministries and regulatory agencies. And secondly, we have this rather unwieldy coalition government with different actors having sometimes very different views on the economy and on other things. All of that said, again, I would hope that with leadership from the top, coming from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance in particular, that we will see big announcements translated into action and implementation on certain reforms that will then set things in train in the direction of less reversibility, less ad hocery, and more policy consistency.
And that's a wrap of Biz First Review 360 for this week. I'll see you again same time, same place next week. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. I'm Nadim Majid. Good night and good luck.